Anyway, Lieutenant Richard Burton and the Crimean War. Although Sir Richard Burton spent almost, but not quite, 20 years in the army of the East India Company, and he continued to use his military rank throughout his life, he did in fact do very little soldiering in the traditional sense of fighting. Perhaps a little strange, as he lived through the rapid expansion through conquest of the British Empire. In fact, we know that Burton saw his way to recognition, advancement and increased pay in the army, not through daring do on the battlefield, but rather through the more intellectual and cultural pursuit of language learning. However, he was involved, albeit on the fringes, in Britain's most famous war of the mid-19th century, the Crimean War. Yes. Burton had returned to Britain in May 1855 after his expedition to Harar and the attack on his encampment at Berbera, which resulted in a scar on his left cheek. The Crimean War had already broken out, and Burton made his way to Constantinople, as was, to try and find a role in Lord Raglan's army. He travelled via Boulogne, so he could spend some time with his sister Maria, who was still living here, and his brother Edward, who was home on leave. But apparently, Indian army officers were looked down on in the Crimea as not being proper soldiers. But Lieutenant Burton was able to find a position under Major General Beatson, who he had met, again, here in Boulogne in 1852. Beatson was a specialist in recruiting irregular cavalry in the service of the British Army. And at this point, I'd like to pause and reflect for a moment. Irregular cavalry seems like a nice euphemism for mercenaries. And the idea of the British Army using mercenaries doesn't correspond to the kind of history I was taught at school, especially not in a war which featured the famous charge of the Light Brigade. However, if we consider the logistical problems faced by the British Army in the Crimea, and these, of course, along with the failures in leadership and command, were well documented by William Howard Russell in the Times, we can begin to understand why the army had to resort to recruiting such mercenary troops. Up until then, major British military campaigns in continental Europe had involved transporting troops and supplies just across the Channel to ports like Boulogne, from where the army could march to its final destination. Clearly, the Black was too far away for this to be possible, so everyone and everything, supplies, equipment, troops and horses, had to be shipped some 2,000 miles. And despite the overall strength of the Royal Navy, it just didn't have enough appropriate vessels to transport an entire army so far. Although the British government commandeered such steamships as Isambard Kingdom Brunel's Great Britain, the round trip to the Black Sea still took about 10 days. And of course these vessels were not purpose-built troop ships. Just consider the horses for a moment. A quick back of an envelope calculation shows the requirement was something like this. Light Brigade, how many horses? 600, you've forgotten your Tennyson. 600 horses for the Light Brigade. Heavy Brigade, presumably the same, another 600. That's 1,200. 100 pieces of artillery, okay, each pulled by 6 horses. Yeah. Reasonable, okay, that's another 600, that's 1,800. Then a horse for every officer of the rank of colonel and above, and there were a lot of them, plus the general staff, plus messengers, etc. You can easily arrive at 2,000 horses. Now, shifting 2,000 horses from the United Kingdom to the coast of the Black Sea was not easy. And it's for this reason that the British Army needed to recruit irregular cavalry. Because apart from the set-piece battles and famous cavalry charges, there was a need for mounted troops for a whole series of other military functions. Protecting marching infantry, harassing the enemy's infantry, scouting missions, disruptive raids on the enemy encampments, foraging, and so on. And we can't imagine that Lieutenant General the Earl of Lucan was going to send a squadron of the 1st Royal Dragoons off to protect the camps of the 57th West Middlesex Regiment of Foot. So hence the need for additional cavalry, and that is the irregulars. And this was General Beatson's speciality. And in this case, Beatson was helped by a local tradition in the Ottoman forces of recruiting so-called Bashi Bazouks, exactly the kind of people that Beatson wanted, who were prepared to fight for little pay, but with the opportunity of rape and plunder in lieu. These fighters tended to come from the fringes of the Ottoman Empire: Kurds, Druze Arabs, Circassians. And as an officer in Beatson's horse, Lieutenant Richard Burton found himself in command of a troop of Muslim Albanians, but Muslim in name only. Burton described his troops' propensity for duelling. Attended by their seconds and close friends, they stood facing each other at close quarters, each holding a cocked pistol in his right hand and a glass of raki in the other. The first to drain his glass was entitled to shoot first, blazed away with generally fatal effect. But it seems that Burton really did try his best by creating a riding school for British officers who had previously only had infantry experience, and insisting on weapons training for all, and acting as Beatson's secretary. It was in this role that Burton said that he personally removed from a dispatch from General Beatson to the British ambassador the General's challenge to an early morning duel. Pistols for 2 and coffee for 1. General Beatson rewarded Burton with a local rank of first captain and then lieutenant colonel, no mean promotion, but this was never officially gazetted. So at the end of his service in the Crimea, Burton returned to being a simple lieutenant without the colonel bit. It should be no surprise that the Bashi Bazouks, bored, resentful of attempts to discipline them, and with no opportunity to do what they had joined up for and did best, the rape and the plunder, eventually mutinied and had to be disarmed by their regular army comrades. Not for the first time, and certainly not the last, Lieutenant Richard Burton's reputation was damaged through little fault of his own. On another front, but still during the Crimean War, in the first biography of Burton I read, it doesn't matter which one, I came across this paragraph. At this conjecture, he, Burton, thought he saw a road to success in the relief of Kars, which had been persistently besieged by the Russians. He submitted a plan, but was dismissed as the most impudent man in the Bombay army. Later, Burton understood that it had been arranged by the Allies that Kars should be allowed to fall as a peace offering to the Russians. And at the time, it seemed a little strange, because although I'm not a military historian, I can't imagine any strategist deliberately choosing to be defeated as an offering before the ensuing peace talks. Surely you try to hold on to territory you know your enemy wants, so it can be exchanged for something you want during the later peace treaty negotiations. But, as I said, I'm not a military historian. A few months later, I read another biography of Burton, which said he, Burton, proceeded in glorious elation to submit his plan for the relief of Kars. He had 2,640 sabres in perfect readiness to march, and he could have procured any quantities of carriages. It was not until some months afterwards that Burton learnt that Kars was doomed to fall as a makeweight for the capture of half of Sebastopol. I remember experiencing a sense of déjà vu, and the same thought about this strategy passed through my mind. Anyway, a few weeks later, in another biography, I came across, in early September 1855, the state of Kars was becoming a scandal. Burton submitted a project for approval. His corps was in perfect readiness to start at any moment, and he could guarantee any amount of means of transport. But some months afterwards, Burton learned that Kars was doomed to fall as a peace offering to the Russians. Essentially, it seems that every Burton biographer until John Godsall, instead of carrying out due diligence and quite frankly switching on their brains, repeated verbatim a story that even in terms of basic logic fails to hold water. Kars is some 1,500 kilometres east of the then Constantinople, today right on the border with Armenia, at the other side of Anatolia, or Asia Minor, and was considered so strategic by the Allied war effort that a senior British officer, Major General William Williams, later known as the hero of Kars, was sent to assist the Turks in the besieged city. The idea that Burton's 2,640 sabres ready to ride could have even reached Kars is laughable, let alone that they could have raised the siege. In fact, throughout the summer and autumn of 1855, a long series of official messages, reports, memoranda, enclosures and exhortations ricocheted between the Foreign Office in London, the British Ambassador in Constantinople, the commander of the British forces in the Crimea, the besieged Major General Williams, the Ottoman government, the nearest British consul to Kars, in a vain attempt to organise a relief force, which at one point was to contain contingent from Bucadere, 10,000. Contingent to be assembled in Bulgaria, 10,000. To be drawn from garrisons in Bulgaria, 5,000. Beeson's horse, 3,000. Albanian light troops, 2,000. Garrison at Batum, 12,000. One regiment of Egyptian regular cavalry, 800. A body of cavalry expected from Tunis, 600. Total, 43,400. Note that Beatson's horse, that is the Bashi-Bazouks with whom Lieutenant Burton served, were to form around 8% of the force. That is 3,000 out of 43,000, rather than, in Burton's plan, to be the whole force on their own. In the end, national rivalries, jealousies, inefficiency, and a seeming complete lack of coordination and sense of urgency meant that Kars fell on the 30th of November 1855, after General Williams, on the instructions of the City Council, negotiated surrender terms with his Russian opposite number. I've been to Kars, and still today, some of the ruins of the redoubts built to protect the city over 150 years ago carry the names of the British officers who led the defence of the city. This plan, this so-called plan, to relieve Kars was Lieutenant Richard Burton's last contribution to the Crimean War. In late September 1855, Beatson was relieved of his command, the first step in what was to lead to a long-running court case in which Burton was called to testify. The Bashi-Bazouks were disbanded, and Burton and Beatson returned to London together. Perhaps, though, we should be grateful that Lieutenant Richard Burton wasn't called upon to prove his heroism on the battlefield during the Crimean War. Battlefields are dangerous places, and soldiers, including junior officers, tend to get killed, or at least seriously wounded. And had Lieutenant Burton's life been cut short in 1855, after his pilgrimage to Mecca, but before his expedition in search of the source of the Nile, before his marriage to Isabel Arundel, before his consular service in West Africa and Brazil, before his journey across the United States, before his curtailed consulship in Damascus, before his dozens of books, before his translation of the 1,000 Nights and a Night, before his translation of the Kama Sutra, Ananga Ranga and the Perfumed Garden, before the time he spent as consul in Trieste, if Lieutenant Richard Burton had joined the estimated 165,363 fatalities among the Allied forces, British, French, Turkish and Piedmontese, in the Crimean War, then, if he had been killed, we almost certainly would not be here in Boulogne today.